Hello and welcome to Third Eye Awakening, the podcast where we talk all about spiritual and psychic awakening, the shift from 3D to 5D consciousness, ascension topics, all manner of expansive things, multidimensionality, all the good stuff. I'm your host, Amy Belair, and I'm so happy that you're here with me. Okay, so this is episode 2, and this is a continuation of my spiritual awakening story. And I'm going to start off with the little bit that I forgot from the first episode. It's a little bit out of sequence, not terribly, but it's really important because it was one of the life-changing moments for me. So I must include it. I really can't leave it out. Okay. So when I was living in Toronto and I was 21 years old, I was walking downtown one beautiful April day, not downtown, through a residential street, and I was just appreciating how beautiful everything was. It was a rainy day, a little bit cool, but it was like more drizzly, and there were little raindrops dangling on things, and the trees were still bare, and everything just looked really beautiful to my eye. And I was inspired to pull out my sketchbook / journal and sketch a house in ballpoint pen, because that's what I had. So I was standing there sketching. I was looking down at my page and drawing, and then looking up at the subject, the house, and then looking back down at my page and drawing what I had just seen, looking back up at the house, looking back down at my page and drawing what I had just seen. And I did that for about half an hour. It was truly just a sketch, nothing fancy and beautiful. But after about half an hour standing there drawing, I looked back up from my page, and all of a sudden, where there hadn't previously been before, there was a large tree right in front of the house. I was dumbfounded. Like, I couldn't believe it. I looked back down at my page and there was no tree in my drawing. I looked back up at the house and there was a tree in front of it with a wheelbarrow leaning against it. I just couldn't believe that I had been standing there for 30 minutes literally drawing that exact scene and had not perceived this tree that was central to the scene. It just really blew my mind. And the reason that it's a pivotal moment for me in my life is that it made me realize that either my senses can't entirely be trusted, but it wasn't really like I didn't feel it in a self-doubt way. I more just felt like, oh shit, like they don't just automatically pick up on everything that's there. It's possible to miss things. And it's not the same as just walking by and not perceiving something because you're preoccupied with something else. It's like I was literally drawing that scene. So my senses did not perceive something that was clearly there. And so it either meant to me that things flicker in and out of reality, and they're not as solid as they appear, which I totally believe to be true to this day. Sort of like sometimes when I lose something, I'll say that it slipped between the realms. It's like there's different realms, and we're moving in and out of them all the time, but we're usually unaware of it. Or potential there's so much more there than what our senses perceive. And I already knew that to be true because, the classic example, like if you sound a dog whistle, like it's too high for our range of hearing, we can't hear it. But obviously it is a tone that exists because dogs can hear it. And we've created machines and instruments and whatever extensions of our senses that can pick up things that are beyond the range of our human senses. But the point is that, like, even though there are things that I know that we can't perceive, even things that are within our ability to perceive, we don't necessarily perceive them. So it just made me feel like whatever explanation it was, there is so much more going on around us at any given time than we perceive through our senses. Okay. And I have a picture of that. Like, I saved that notebook because that sketch was in it. And I drew the tree in over top, and you can see that I drew it in after the fact with ballpoint pen, and made a little note to myself, like, wake the fuck up. So I will take a picture of that, and I will include it in my Instagram if anyone wants to have a look and see the proof. Okay, so that was my story from before when I was 21. Now we're fast forwarding, and I am 22 years old, and I'm living with my soulmate. We're having a challenging but very loving, connected, romantic relationship. And through him, I encountered my greatest expander, and like, truly, it's kind of a dramatic word, but it really feels like this person is my savior, because this person made me feel so articulated, I guess, even though we've never met. And that person is John Fushante of the Red Hot Chili Peppers fame. He's the amazing guitar player. He also has his own solo career. And at the time, I had never heard of him, but my soulmate did really appreciate him as an artist. And so I got into him and started listening to him. And I just have to give a shout out to him, because like, he really has been like a touchstone and an anchor for me. His music and his lyrics articulate things that I felt unable to articulate. It made me feel like he and I are aliens from the same planet, and we speak the same language. And it just was such a massive comfort to me that there is another one of me in the world. Now, of course, I know now that there are many, 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 many of us from, different off-earth worlds. But at the time, I had no knowledge or concept of star beings or off-earth lives, and it just felt like, oh, I recognize you. I could talk about John Fushante for hours, and I'm not going to, but maybe I will sometime make a podcast in his honor. We'll see. So the next thing that happened on my spiritual unfolding, was that I stumbled across the book Spiritual Midwifery one day at a used bookstore called Seekers in the Annex of Toronto. And that book, if anyone has ever checked it out, it's so funny, because it's like this collection of birth stories from a hippie commune called The Farm. And they use very, very hippie language. It's super, super funny. But the amazing thing about it is that those people decided that they were not doing birth according to the Western hospital healthcare model anymore. They were taking it back for themselves, because it had gotten to a place of being like so abusive to women and so dishonoring of the miracle that is birth. There's no room left for like the soul or spirit or anything, or honoring the mystery. And they decided that they were having none of that, and they self-trained on how to deliver their own babies. And they published a book of birth stories, people's successful home commune births. And this was the first time that I had ever encountered anything that articulated my understanding of motherhood. So for me, pregnancy, birth, and motherhood have never been, just about like breeders making another human, another mouth in the world. I really always understood it to be a truly miraculous event, no matter how common it is, where there's a soul that's waiting for entry. It's excited. It's fucking excited about coming into this life. It's pumped. And it's waiting for the perfect circumstances through which to live out its mission. And so I'm having a hard time articulating it. It is waiting for the perfect circumstances. It's waiting for the perfect avatar. It is a co-creator in the whole experience. It drives the development of the little avatar that will be its body. And it's coming in with a mission in its heart to fulfill in the world. And so I always understood birth to be that, and pregnancy and motherhood to be that sacred. But I had never really heard it articulated as such. And so when I read that book, I was like, oh, this is for me. And shortly thereafter, I became pregnant with my oldest son. He is an incredible being. So being pregnant with him was really, really expansive in terms of my spiritual awakening, because I understood myself, even though I was very young and very just still a young person, still having a lot of the struggles and the self-esteem things and just like the nonsense programs that young people, at least of my generation, struggle with. A lot of the immaturity. I was very immature in a lot of ways and very mature in other ways. But anyway, I understood my experience as being a vessel for the creation of the avatar that this little soul, this mighty soul, this mighty being was planning to inhabit. And as I approached the birth, I understood myself to be a portal for this soul to enter the world with us. And as I moved into motherhood, I understood myself to be a keeper, a safe keeper and a guardian, an ally for this soul who was not inferior to me, did not belong to me, I understood that he needed my guardianship and perhaps my guidance, but he did not need me to teach him. He came in with all of the wisdom and knowledge that he would ever need. And I just had to witness it unfold in its own time and try my best to not interfere. So one of the really cool things that happened during the pregnancy was that I had this name picked out for him. Sylvester Ulysses was the name, and it was inspired by a beautiful Nigerian man that I had met on the streetcar maybe a year prior, and he had just struck up a conversation with me to be friendly and conversational, and we exchanged our names. And when he told me that his name was Sylvester, he delivered it with this like radiant smile. He was really a beautiful soul, like just emanating so much light. And when he said his name that way, I was like, wow, that's a beautiful name. I had always thought of it in the context of Sylvester Stallone and, Sylvester and Tweety, and had never really taken it seriously before. But when it rolled off his tongue that way, I was just like, woo, magic. And I loved that name, and I loved Ulysses as the explorer. And so that was the name I had picked out for this little being. And as I got into nearing the 8th month of pregnancy, I just started to know. I just knew that wasn't his name. He was letting me know, and I could hear him. So I was a little bit stumped, like, oh man, I've been planning this name the whole time. What am I going to pick now? And we cycled through a whole bunch of names, and none of them fit. But one day, it came to all three of us. We were living with a friend at the time. All three of us received the name Francis in some iteration at the same time. So Francis, Francisco, and I think that was it. Francis and Francisco. Anyway, we had a kitten at the time, and a fuzzy little Himalayan kitten, and we first decided to use that name for him, Francisco the Fuzz. But right away I knew that it was actually the spirit of this baby that was letting us know that this was his name. And we all agreed right away. And it was the only name that his father and I could agree on. And we agreed instantly. It was super validating to have the experience of all three of us receiving that information at the same time. And it was my first clear experience of communicating with a spirit that was not incarnate. And that was really, really cool. He also just had an energy about him that I could feel the whole time. Now, I didn't know if he was going to be a boy or a girl, but I was fairly certain he was going to be a boy. I think I was still holding space for the possibility that he was going to be a girl, but just because I wanted the surprise. But I kind of knew because of the ultrasound pictures. I mean, the anatomy was pretty clear. And I could just sense the energy around him. And as his personality has unfolded, he's almost 15 now. It was absolutely spot on. It was so accurate what I was sensing. I decided to have him at home. And I was so fortunate that in my small town, when I needed prenatal care, there happened to be a midwifery practice that had opened a satellite clinic right in my town, like literally around the corner from where my parents lived. That was a huge boon because midwifery was still fairly new and fairly young. It was only about 10 years old and it was not in the mainstream at all. I mean, it still isn't. It's on its way, but it was like the alternative crunchy granola choice for weird crunchy granola people. So I felt so incredibly fortunate and blessed by the universe that I could access the kind of care that I wanted that meant so much to me without even having to drive anywhere. It was amazing, amazing. And I will always love my first midwife, Linda Stahl now, with all my heart. She'll never know how much I love her because I'm not a weird stalker about it, but I could be. That's how much I love her. Anyway, so I had a home birth, and this was my first opportunity to really set my mind to something that was going to be very hard and require all of my will and determination and resolve and see it through. Of course, when it's your first baby, nobody can prepare you. Nobody can prepare you for the agony that is labor, especially when your baby is occiput posterior and you have horrendous back labor for hours. In total, from the point that my water broke to the point so my water broke before labor started. So from the point that my water broke to the point that my baby was born, it was 27 hours. Most of that was spent contracting. It was truly agonizing. But I managed to get through it. And honestly, what I drew upon was my primal instincts, my connection to my body, my connection to my breath. And I was not being conscious about it. I wasn't like, oh, my breath. It's like all I could do to get through a contraction was breathe in as deeply as possible and just ride that wave of agony for 60 to 80 seconds until it was over. But it worked, and I connected also with, all the other mothers who had ever gone before me and visualized myself as a portal opening up to allow this person in. And I reasoned with myself that the whole entire world has to energetically and physically shift to make room for a new being to come into it. It's kind of like displacing, when you add more water to something, to water in a container, like all the other water has to displace until it finds its equilibrium again. And I reasoned that if the entire world was having to make a shift, an energetic and physical shift, and I am the nexus point of this shift, then it stands to reason that it will be experienced as very intense for me. And that was enough. That and the tremendous support of my my midwife, my partner, and my youngest sister. And I got through the labor and I gave birth to my son at home. It was also an incredible experience because the whole way through I knew he was okay and I had no concerns for him. Mind you, his heart rate was fine, but at the time I was not trained in any kind of obstetrical anything, and all I was going on was pure instinct. And I just knew intuitively that he was fine and that we were working together through this. And then even my midwife told me after he was born that she thought I should be a midwife too, because when he came out, he was a little stunned, as some babies are, and he didn't start breathing on his own right away. And they considered, I'm not sure that they actually did cut and clamp the cord and take him away to work on him. I honestly can't remember. It was too long ago and I was not experienced in being able to perceive those things, or if they just thought about it. But she said that I picked up on their worry and I said, "Don't worry, he's in there." And I remember knowing that. I remember looking at his eyes and knowing he was in there. So I feel like he and I, from the very get-go, have had incredible, amazing communication with each other. And it went all the way through the pregnancy and the birth, and it carried on, of course, into the early postpartum period. He was the most reasonable and patient baby imaginable. He was just truly, he feels like a very ancient and wise and experienced energy to me, and he did even when he was a baby. That's the best way I can put it. He was so patient with me. Like, he knew that I was a new mom, that my experience was limited, and that my heart was in the right place, and he tried so hard to communicate with me telepathically before resorting to crying. And most of the time I was able to pick up on what he was putting down telepathically. And that was really cool as well, because it was my first experience with strong telepathic communication. And it really made me realize how telepathic we all are, and that we get a little bit lazy because we lean so heavily on language. And so this part of our communicative ability is a little bit atrophied, needs to be dusted off and beefed up a little bit, but it's there. It is there. I'm telling you, I work with newborns now all the time, and they're so clear in their telepathic communication. It's incredible. We have the ability. It's there. So, of course, when I was pregnant with Francis, I stopped using marijuana or any other drugs. I wasn't really much of a drug user. I just smoked marijuana sometimes. But I stopped that during pregnancy. And so everything else that I tell in my story onward has not been influenced by any kind of substance use at all. And I just want to say that because I feel like that is a way to potentially invalidate somebody's psychic experiences, is to say, or spiritual awakening experiences. If they use any kind of drugs, it's to like pin it on the drugs. But as you'll hear, as I tell my story moving forward, it really made no difference one way or the other. In fact, the only thing that marijuana use has done for me before when I used to use it, was because I used it daily, it really enhanced my anxiety. That's just how I respond to it. I know other people respond to it differently, and it has the opposite effect. It calms them down. But for me, it just aggravated my anxiety horribly. So it really wasn't that hard to stop using it. Anyway, when my son Francis was about 5 months old, his father and I broke up. It was an extremely volatile and painful breakup, and very, very traumatizing for both of us. But ultimately what it comes down to is when you have a couple that is already unhealthy and toxic and very emotional and not stable together to begin with, and then you add a newborn baby to the mix, of course, it's not going to go any better at all. we both deeply loved Francis, deeply loved Francis. And I just want to openly acknowledge that his father has always been an incredible father, very, very present and tuned in and prioritizing of his relationship with his son. And I'm just very, very proud of him in the way that he's shown up into fatherhood. But we couldn't stay together at all. And so we broke up and I moved back in with my parents, and was incredibly heartbroken because it wasn't out of any kind of lack of love. It was just a toxic relationship, a very, very, very toxic dynamic. So it was the kind of thing where you agonize and you want to get back together and you're desperately searching for a way that it can work out. And I was blaming myself for everything. I was just young and had so few tools at my disposal to navigate that intensity of a breakup and those awful feelings. And one of the things that happened is that I started having even more vivid and intense dreams, often prophetic, but sometimes they were just vivid and intense. For example, around that time, a few months after we had broken up, I had this dream where I was in a different body, a man's body, and I walked into a room and saw a handgun, a pistol, lying on a table, and I picked up the pistol and put it to my head and pulled the trigger, and everything turned red, and I slumped over and rose up out of my body and looked at my body bleeding out and dying. Like, I can't even explain that unless, even to this day, I mean, this is where the claircognizance doesn't come in. I don't know if that was just a dream, just a manifestation of my psyche. I wasn't feeling suicidal at the time because I had a baby who I was living for. He's like everything to me. So it wasn't, I wasn't consciously having suicidal thoughts. Maybe it was a subconscious manifestation. Maybe it was an attachment to someone else's experience. Maybe it was a past life memory. I don't know. At any rate, it was a pretty fucked up dream to have. I also started having a lot of dreams about ghosts at that time. Literally the earthbound remnants of deceased people, consciousness. And I would basically, in my dreams, I would come close to the consciousness of ghosts. And these, I know these weren't dreams. Like, they were happening while I was asleep, but they were astral projections. My first experiences of astral projections. I would connect with the consciousness of a ghost. Sometimes I would just observe what had happened to lead up to the ghosting of the ghost. So an example is that one time I dreamt about the consciousness, I dreamt about a Russian man who had a daughter, and he was a ghost that was haunting a girls' boarding school. And I'm not sure what that building was used for before or how he got stuck there. I'm not sure if he was attracted to the energy of all the young girls, but what I saw as the story behind him was that at some point in his life, he was walking past the bedroom of his daughter when she was a teenager, and he saw her naked through the crack in the door and changing, and he sort of was titillated. He was aroused by this moment he was seeing, and he paused and looked through and sort of peeping Tom'd his daughter. And it was just momentary. It was a momentary indulgence of that curiosity, but he was so ashamed of his own arousal towards his daughter, so ashamed. And he never forgave himself for that. He never let it go. And so he was on a repeat loop. That piece of his consciousness that hadn't been integrated and forgiven and released was on a repeat loop at a girls' boarding school towards the corner. Like there's like a set of stairs at the very end of the hallway. And he would kind of like be felt in the stairwell and seen in the stairwell, and then rounding the corner and passing just the first couple of doors. And it's like he was reliving that over and over, but he wasn't doing it. He wasn't a pervy ghost. He was like, it's just a piece of his consciousness that had not been released because it was so densely weighed down in shame. So that was one example of a dream that I had. Another example was that I dreamt that I was out driving, and in the like high beams of my car headlights at night, I saw like a misty apparition of a young Asian girl holding a little stuffy, and she was just lost. She had died and she didn't know what happened, and she didn't know where her parents were or where she was or where anyone was. And she was really, I wasn't able to release the Russian man, but I was able to release this little Asian girl. It was very easy. She was just ready. She just didn't know where she was, and she was waiting for someone to find her. So through the incredible pain of this breakup, it's like it cracked my ego defenses open even more, and more psychic information was able to come through. I also had my first spontaneous astral travels, non-related to ghosts, where through one dream, it was during a nap, I traveled. So my younger sister Meg was living in France at this time on an academic exchange for a year. And as I was napping, I spontaneously traveled somewhere where I was with her. I don't remember if it was in France or not, but I remember waking up just before I came back into my body, and I had that like really intense feeling of sleep paralysis, and then thunk, the rest of me came back in, and like my heart was pounding, lots of adrenaline. My psyche was like, what the literal fuck just happened? Because it was not a consciously decided upon astral projection. But I remember, like, I was like, oh, I was just with Meg. Wow. And then I also had a dream where I arrived in a meadow, a beautiful meadow full of wildflowers and under a blue sky. Oh, it was so beautiful. And I was just with my dad's father, who'd passed away, my grand-papa Léonce, and my dad's sister, who had passed away, Lina. And we were together. I don't remember what we were talking about, but it was similar, where I woke up with that startle, where I kind of woke up before my spirit was back in my body, and my body was like, what? And then my spirit thunked back in, and my heart was pounding, but I remembered that I had just been with them. And at that time, I also became really interested in past lives. This was my first real discovery of past lives. A friend, my beautiful, magical friend, Lindsay, recommended to me the book. Actually, she lent it to me, Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss. And this was like perfectly timed. I think she'd even given it to me like maybe a year prior, but I had never looked into it until that point. And I really was motivated by trying to understand why things went the way they went with my son's father. I knew that we knew each other from somewhere before. And why was this so painful? And why had I had a dream, sort of like preparing me for it? What does it all mean? Why? I just wanted to understand why. And so I tried to do the past life hypnosis guided meditations, and it was to no avail. Like, it just didn't work. And I think it's because my overall vibration was one of desperation, not openness. I feel that sometimes in order to get information that you're looking for, you kind of have to be calm and neutral and unattached to, getting your answer or not. And I was anything but unattached. So I tried to explore my past lives, and then after a while I gave up. And I became very connected to my artistic self. I just needed an outlet for all of the feelings I was having and all the crazy dreams and the crazy experiences. And I felt like I could not share this with anyone. The only person I had felt comfortable sharing it with had been my son's father. And now, we were in a position where we literally couldn't talk to each other or see each other because it was too bad. And so I had nobody to talk to about it. And even by then, we had not really been supportive of each other in those ways anymore for quite a while anyway. So it was really hard to have all these experiences and not feel like I could talk about them with anyone, at least not anyone who was close by. And this was way before cell phones were, a common thing that everybody has in their possession, when email was the fast way of communicating with people, but it was still kind of old and clunky, and we all had DSL connections or something like that. Yes, I'm old, whatever. So I was struggling, but I was doing a lot of art, and I decided that I literally could not be a waitress in my small town and a single mom. That just wasn't, I was too depressed. I had to do something. I had to do something to improve my situation. And I decided to apply for art school and midwifery school. I did not get into midwifery school in Ontario. It's very, very competitive to get in. There are only 3 universities that offer the program, and it's a consortium, meaning that you can only apply to one of them. And they only have about 30 spots each per year. So basically you have a 1 in 30 chance of getting in. And I applied and I didn't get in. But I did get into art school. And that was really exciting, and I'm so happy that I did. Art school was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. So I moved back to Toronto with Francis and got ready to go back to art school. And I found this great little apartment. My baby sister Andrea helped me find this great little apartment in Parkdale. It was a 2-bedroom apartment on the corner of Queen and Lansdowne, above a pizza place and a shoe store, and it was just the perfect little sanctuary from all the madness of living in the city, because as you can imagine, since I struggled with it before in my highly empathic ways, I was set up to struggle with it again because I was even more psychically open at this point. But my apartment was the ideal place to sort of find sanctuary. And while I was there, I again resumed past life exploration, but I had released the need to find an explanation for why things transpired the way they did between my son's father and I. I have never found my answer to that, but I really, once I released the need or the curiosity, it's always been gone. I just intuitively feel like I don't need to know. It won't make my life better to know. It won't necessarily make my life worse to know, but it's just easier to let sleeping dogs lie, if that makes sense. I know I'll get my answer once I die and merge back into spirit, and that's good enough for me. I feel that way actually about a lot of my closest relationships. I deliberately don't look into our past life connections unless there's a particular, it feels like there's a wound or an unhealthy dynamic or some kind of sticking point that I'm struggling to work through, where I can feel that I need, a missing puzzle piece in order to understand it. Other than that, I generally don't just look into my past life connections for the sake of curiosity, simply because I almost feel like it's none of my business. That's just the feeling. It's not that I think I can't get the information. It's just none of my business and not relevant to it's not conducive to honoring the relationship as it is right now. So because I had released that intense need to get that particular answer, when I started exploring past lives again, I started getting things pretty much right away. It was pretty amazing. The first two memories that I got were actually off-Earth world memories. And that was very confusing because I still had never run across that concept. I didn't know anything about starseeds. It hadn't occurred to me that there could be life on other planets. I had never really thought about aliens, whatever. So I kind of thought, I don't know, like I knew I didn't make it up, because when I am just daydreaming, like I'm a big daydreamer, so I know what my daydreams feel like. I am the one who is in control, and I am calling in and conjuring up the imagery in my daydreams. Even when I just let it flow, I can feel the difference between receiving something outside of me that is unbidden versus sort of re-experiencing a memory versus creating and imagining something with my own imagination. So I was really thrown by the first memory because it was similar enough to an Earth life that I think I just wrote it off, kind of. I was like, well, it was something, but I don't know what it was. And then I got the second one and I was like, oh, that's what's going on. So I'll try my best to explain them. The first one was a life on a world that was very similar to Earth. It was a 3D environment, a physical environment, and it was maybe it was Earth, I don't know. And I was a different kind of creature than what we know to exist on Earth. Actually, I don't know, because it was very geographically similar. Like this, as I recall it, and it was many years ago now, but the sky was the same color. The forest looked the same, like brown earth, grayish brown tree trunks, green foliage, that kind of thing, gray rocks, blah, blah, blah. But in this memory, I was a creature living amongst a community of creatures that had like tough green skin, but the build of a human. So, 2 legs and feet, standing upright, arms, hands, a torso, a head and a neck. And so the skin was kind of like rough and green, and the hair was brown. And we wore sort of like a rough spunish slash like leathery sort of hand sewn clothing that wasn't overly fancy. And we were creatures that had self-awareness and intelligence, and we had some tools, but the tools weren't particularly advanced. We didn't have I wouldn't even necessarily call it technology. I guess it depends on your definition of technology, but we had tools to use and to help make things a little bit easier, but not, like I said, nothing fancy. It was more like household tools, like things to hold our drinking vessels or, food vessels and that kind of thing. And we lived in little thickets. We would sort of make little leaf den homes for ourselves or live in the roots of large trees, that kind of thing. And our disposition was, it's like we were very emotionless. We did not have a lot of emotions. We felt some emotions, but we were very factual about it, kind of like what I imagine Klingons to be like, or Data from the Next Generation, maybe. Just very matter of fact. So we lived in this environment, and there was a large natural predator, which it looked like a very large hairy lizard, fur-covered lizard. And that's how most of us died, was, as like food for this natural predator. And in that life, that was how I died. And we had like, you know, a nervous system that was primed for staying alive, but we didn't have any particular attachment to life, like in the sense that like it's just a matter of fact that everybody dies, it's not a big deal. Your body releases adrenaline, you have fight or flight because you are attempting to stay alive, but it didn't even feel like there was a strong drive to procreate that I recall from that memory. But we must have procreated because there was a community of us. So anyway, I died in the jaws of one of these creatures, and I remember that I was not overly fussed about it. It was just like, oh, I'm dying. That's all there was to it. But interestingly, in that memory, there was also a woman who was like a wise woman and a medicine woman, and she had long gray hair, and she had a greater emotional range than everyone else, and she was sort of like the leader of the group, and that's about all I remember. So as you can imagine, like this is my first past life memory ever, and I've never heard of anybody remembering living on different planets or different dimensions or anything like that. So I was kind of like, okay, well, I don't know. But I wrote it down anyway. And then maybe a couple days later, I did another sort of past life meditation kind of thing. And this one was the one that made me know that I was receiving information, and it really validated the other one because they came through in the same way. So this one happened in a flash. It's going to be really hard to describe because it was so different from the environment that we live in on Earth that I'm not sure if I can truly convey it in words, but I will try. It was not this dimension. I don't know which dimension it was, but it was a higher dimension. It wasn't a lower one. Nothing felt substantial. Nothing felt physical. I was a creature that I don't even know how to describe it. It's like, it was like pink, white, iridescent, like a cross between an eel and a fish, and that weird luck dragon from The Neverending Story, and what are they called? An axolotl. Like it was just, but it wasn't a physical thing. It was just suspended in a non-physical black environment. There was no, I was going to say there was no light. There was no light source to account for my ability to see this stuff. Like there was no sun, whatever, but there were iridescent, it almost looked like stars, but I don't know that it was stars because it wasn't a physical environment. And I was just suspended in this non-physical environment, and I was rippling, and that's how I know I was iridescent, because of the way that the light moved as I rippled along. And then it was over. Like that was it. It felt like more of a mental environment. There were no emotion. There was nothing emotional in my experience of that, receiving that memory. But I knew that that was me. I knew that that was my air quotes body, or I don't even know. It's so hard to try and translate into terms that make sense for us here. But I hope that I semi-conveyed it. I don't know. I swear, this is the bane of my gifts, is that because I receive things clairvoyantly, they are things that are so challenging to translate so that they can be understood by other people. It's very frustrating. Anyway, so so I had those two memories and I didn't really know what to do with them. So I just sort of wrote them down, tucked them away, and carried on with my life. And then sometime later, I had my first human past life recollection. And I was a female, a young female in a civilization that looked very much like ancient Rome. But I don't know if that's what it was, but it looked like that time period, that dress, the architecture, whatever. And all I saw was that I was walking with my cousin, who was a very, very beautiful young woman. And she was desired by someone who was like higher up in the government or whatever. And he requested that she be obtained for him. And I just happened to be with her, and they had no use for me. And so we were both sort of kidnapped or taken. We were hit over the back of the head and taken, and she was taken to this person, and I was taken to the that ring where rich people would like sit and watch people, like gladiators and stuff like that. I can't remember what it's called right now. And I didn't know where I was when I came to. I was just like in a dark place, and somebody was shoving me towards a door. I had no idea what was happening, and the door opened and I was shoved through, and the light was blinding, and I could hear people all around me, and my heart was pounding, so I didn't know what was going on. And then I sensed the presence of lions, probably, or some kind of beast that was terrifying. And I opened my eyes and could kind of start to see the outlines of them coming towards me. And I remember distinctly feeling the absolute panic, like the like absolute fear. And that's how I died. It didn't take long because I was so disoriented. I did not have time to come up with any kind of survival strategy. So I was probably pretty boring for the spectators, but anyway, so that was that too. And around the same time, I was also continuing to experience like really, really profound and borderline crippling empathy. And I started receiving messages for people and around people. So one example that I can remember is that I remember being at IKEA, and I saw an older man, probably in his 40s or 50s, older than me anyway. I was in my 20s, and he was wearing a suit. He was like a businessman, and I don't know why, but I felt so compelled to go over and hug him. I could feel his sadness, and it's like I just knew that he really needed human connection and a hug. And I didn't do it because I did not feel nervy enough to do that as a young woman in my 20s. But I've kind of always regretted it, to be honest, that I let that opportunity go. Another time I saw a kid on a streetcar, and he was kind of a funny looking kid, but he had such incredible eyes. And I could literally feel spirit nudging me and being like, tell him, tell him, tell him. He needs to hear it. Tell him this is from us, not you. And so I told him that he has the most beautiful eyes, and he just totally lit up. And I could just tell by the feeling I got from that I am supposed to share the things that come through me from spirit. So September rolled around and I went to art school, and it was a huge relief because I was surrounded by people who, at least if nothing else, understood like the eccentricity of, being a right-brained person, and, who didn't really doubt psychic things. It was still not something that was talked about, like spiritual awakening and psychic topics were not addressed at school anywhere, but it was just a beautiful opportunity for me to sort of let down my guard and feel a little bit more at home and a little bit less like I had to be keeping all this stuff a secret or to myself. And while I was at school, I had my first encounter of science, astronomy, physics, quantum physics. And that just made all the difference to me. It was, I guess the first way I encountered it was through the documentary, What the Bleep Do We Know? And if anybody is listening and they take their science very seriously, I'll just make this disclaimer. I understand that that is not quantum physics. I really do get that. I get that it's not, that is considered a pseudoscience at best, but it does do a beautiful job at articulating complicated concepts around the true nature of reality and using, fairly modern discoveries in science and theoretical physics to help us understand that there is more to this matrix than we generally perceive. Okay, that's it. That's my disclaimer. I became so interested in astronomy and celestial mechanics, as well as molecular physics, subatomic physics. It was just so interesting to me, and it just made me feel like, oh my God, this is what I'm experiencing. I knew the world wasn't, what we take it for granted to be. I fucking knew it. And I will also just say that I have a kind of number dyslexia. Math is not my strength. Numeracy is not my strength. So I'm not purporting to be a scientist or understand science to the same degree that somebody who has numeracy skills can understand it. But I am able to understand the concepts very clearly, and I think they're beautiful, and they were total lifesavers for me at that time. It also helped me to start understanding the concept of time travel, and that, in fact, I never understood, once I really started to consider time travel and my own experiences of time travel, which I think I will talk about in the next episode, I realized that it's kind of hilarious that we think we need a machine to do it. I really actually don't get that, because our consciousness is able to do it. It's about discipline with our consciousness. Anyway, yeah, I'll talk about that more in the next episode. Also, during this period, I deliberately learned how to befriend the darkness and the winter. I decided I could not handle another winter of depression, or at least, depression that was worse because I was depressed by the winter, and I had to find the magic and the beauty in it. I had to, for the sake of my mental and emotional well-being. And so I learned how to do that, which is something I'm very passionate about helping people to do. It's about the darkness and the winter, but it's also about the dark cycles in people's lives. I've learned how to navigate them and come out on the other side better than I was before. I love to teach about how to do that. So the final thing that I'll talk about in this segment is probably the most intense and important past life memory experience that I have ever had. I had a few more in between in there, but they were pretty mundane, not really worth taking the time to share. But this one that I'm about to share, I think, is the one life that has the most connection with this life that I am experiencing. It has the most direct karmic tie. So one day I was at home and Francis was at daycare, and I was watching the movie Goya about the artist Francisco de Goya, and it takes place during the Spanish Inquisition, and it's quite an intense movie, I guess, let's put it that way. But while I was watching it, I was not in a deliberate meditation or anything. This wasn't anything I was trying to conjure up. I suddenly received the memory of being alive during the Spanish Inquisition. And I couldn't even really see myself because it was so dark where I was. But I know that I was small. I was probably a kid. I was really a nobody. I was an orphan, a street urchin. I probably belonged to the church or whatever orphans belong to, where they work in exchange for like some form of shelter and food. And I worked in the dungeons where people were horrendously tortured for the crime of supposedly not being Christian or Catholic, for the crime of presumably being Jewish. And it was my job to bring water to the people in the dungeon, bring food to them, moldy, disgusting food, clean up their feces, clean up the torture room after the torture was over. And it was so horrible. I can remember the agonized screams of people who were not only having their bodies, their minds, their spirits, their emotions broken, but shattered by disgusting torture. I remember the agonized moans and wails of people in horrible pain in their cells. I remember the putrid, disgusting smells of blood and infection and rotting flesh and feces and urine and vomit and mold. I remember the sound of rats. I remember the fear. I remember being so horrified constantly, like my nervous system was in a constant state of abject terror that I could be put on the torture rack myself, and my strategy was simply to be as small and unassuming and invisible as possible, do what I was told, never talk, be obedient. I don't even know that I wanted to live and survive. I just was so small. I had no concept of dying as a release. All I wanted was to not be tortured. I remember I wanted to help people, but I didn't feel safe to help anyone. And I felt totally powerless. I think it was my first life on Earth. It wasn't my first life as a soul. I had lived elsewhere before, but it was my first trip to Earth, and I remember returning to spirit and being like, what the literal fuck is this place? It was horrifying. Even now as I tell this, I tell it while with my eyes closed and like rubbing the tops of my lap to sort of self-soothe. I have a full body emotional reaction when I remember all of that stuff. And because it came on unbidden, I felt completely unprepared for it, and it crashed over me. I had no boundaries up at all. And when I received that memory, I cried and sobbed and shook with my sobs. It was a horrible memory. And yeah, in one of the upcoming episodes, I will explain how it ties into this life. But I will just say right now that I'm so glad I'm not alive in that time anymore. And my heart truly goes out to anyone and everyone who is living through that degree of fear and terror in the world right now, because there certainly still are people having that experience. Okay, what a note to end on. Anyway, But this has been a long episode, so I am going to wrap it up. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned if you are interested in for the next episode, in which I will discuss my first forays into the Akashic Records, walking between the dimensions, the bullshit that was my Saturn return, more psychic dreams, my first experiences with conscious mediumship, and how I came to learn about manifestation. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. If you enjoyed it, I would love it if you would leave me a rating or a kind review, or if you would subscribe. Certainly if you know somebody else who you think would benefit from hearing any of this or would be interested in it, please feel free to share with them. And I would love it if you took a picture, a screenshot of yourself listening to this episode, and then post it on your social media stories and tag me in it. I am on Instagram at thenorthstar.love, and I'm on Facebook as Amy Melissa. And that way I will know that you've been listening. I really appreciate your time and your ears and your heart and your spirit. I hope, like with the last episode, that any of this feels validating to you, and at very least just interesting to you. And I want to give a shout out. I was supposed to in my last episode and I didn't. I want to give a shout out to my talented son Francis, who is the creator of that opening clip. Also, I want to say that I listened back to my audio for this one, and partway through, I think what was happening was my hair was rubbing up against my earbud microphone, and it creates a lot of background interference, and I'm super sorry. I actually am ordering a microphone so that this is not an issue anymore. Thank you for bearing with me through my amateur podcasting. Seriously appreciate it. Love you all. I hope you have a great day, and that wherever you are starting to truly remember and experience your own magic and power and psychicness. Lots of love.